Making good use of layouts is essential to creating an easy to maintain, flexible, and thriving Hugo website. So let's see what makes them tick. What is a layout? A layout is used for all the framing on the page around the content. Think of the things that remain relatively the same across pages, for example, the header and footer. These are the things that usually live in a layout. In Hugo, each page on the site is a content file. At the top is a small snippet of metadata called front matter, followed by markdown. The goal of a content file is to store content in its purest form. There's rarely any HTML or other presentation logic in a content file. All the fancy HTML to display and format the content lives in the layout. One layout might be used for multiple content files. For example, on a portfolio website, you might use the same layout for your About page and your services page. Other times, particularly if you're doing something quite intricate, you might have a layout specifically for an individual content page. There's a Hugo concept called page bundles, which can be tricky to get your head around. We're going to do the bare minimum here to get your site going. By default, content pages use a layout called single. Creating a content file, which is named exactly _index.md, underscore and all, is the exception to this. These pages act like a table of contents for pages around it and use a layout called list by default. Just like a good nonfiction book, it's a good practice to start off with a table of contents. You'll do this for the homepage of your site. If that all sounded confusing, it's much simpler than it actually sounds. Create a file called _index.md in the directory content. And inside, I'll paste some content. These triple dash lines indicate the metadata or front matter I mentioned before. We'll get into this in a future lesson. And below is the markdown content. Hugo has a hierarchy to figure out which layout to use for a content file. The last fallback is looking for a layout in the _default directory. Let's create a default list layout for your homepage. So in layouts, I'll create _default. And inside that, I'll create a file called list.html. And I'll paste some contents in here. So this is a very basic HTML page. The only thing that might be unfamiliar here is these curly braces. So these curly braces are rendering content from our content file, which is the _index.md we created before. And it's using Hugo templating, which we'll get into in a later lesson. You've got everything you need to render your first page. Will it build or will it error? There's only one way to find out. Hugo has a command called serve, which will build your site and serve it locally at localhost on port 1313 by default. So we can run Hugo serve in the root of the site, which will start up the server, and then navigate to this address here in our browser. Look at you go. That's real content rendering through a layout on your Hugo site. Let's celebrate with a second page on your site. So we're going to create an About page. So I'll go into Content, create a new file, and I'm going to name it about.md. Notice there's no underscore here. That's only for this table of contents page. Inside, we're going to have a similar structure to the index page. So we have our front matter, where we're setting a title, and then markdown content. Like I said before, if it's not a table of contents page, it's going to use a layout called single by default. We could clone this list layout and call it single, and that would work fine, but you'd be left maintaining two very similar versions of the same layout. We want to reduce repetition and make our lives easier wherever possible. So instead, we'll create a new layout in _default called baseof.html. And this is going to be the parent layout of both list.html and single.html. So I'll paste some HTML structure here. And this is almost identical to our current list layout. The only difference is instead of outputting content here, we have this block main.end. This block is a placeholder that other layouts can use to only specify that part of the page. So let's do that in the list layout. So instead of all this structure, we can simply define main and output the content in there. And we'll do exactly the same for our single layout, which we'll create now. So it's defining main, and then it's just going to output content. If you navigate directly to localhost port 1313/about, you'll see your new about page. This is a Hugo course, so we're not going to get into any CSS. However, you and I can both agree that the default browser styles leave a lot to be desired. Not only am I going to give you a style sheet, it's going to be a sass style sheet to make it easy to maintain as you expand your website. We already have a directory called static, where all the static assets live. If we were using a plain CSS file, this would be the place to put it. We're using sass, which needs to be processed into a CSS file. We'll create a directory in the root called assets. This is where the assets that need some form of processing will live. Inside assets, we'll create a directory called sass. This is where our .scss files will live. Let's create a main file called main, and I'll paste in some HTML. We also need to reference the style sheet in our HTML. So we'll open up the base of layout and add the following to below title. What this is doing is it's telling Hugo where to find the sass file and how to build it. And then it's going to output that link into a style sheet tag. The nice thing about having this in the base of layout is it will apply to both the list and single layout. You may need to restart your Hugo serve to see the changes in the browser. So I'm going to Control-C this and run it again. The only way to access the About page currently is by navigating to it directly. In the next lesson, we'll add site navigation using a Hugo partial.